Hey there, Arctic adventurers. Snowflake, before we dive into this heart-stopping tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The wind howled like a hungry beast, sweeping across the endless stretch of ice and snow. My breath came out in shallow puffs, barely visible in the freezing air. I had been out here for hours, my sled cutting through the thick drifts, my dogs pressing forward with tired determination. The Arctic was unforgiving. Every second in this white wilderness felt like a battle against nature itself. But tonight, something felt different. I don't know why, but a strange unease had settled in my gut, an instinct I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted, carrying something unusual with it, a faint, distant sound almost too soft to be real. It wasn't the whistle of the storm. It wasn't the crack of shifting ice. It was something else. Something fragile. I pulled on the reins, bringing my sled to a stop. My dogs panted, their fur crusted with frost, eyes flicking toward me as if questioning my sudden hesitation. I strained my ears, listening past the howl of the wind. And then there it was again, a faint whimper, barely more than a whisper. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold crept down my spine. I knew these lands well. I had traveled through blizzards, faced down towering walls of ice, and watched the sun sink into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. But never, not once, had I heard a sound like this. A whimper out here? I stepped off my sled, my boots sinking into the thick snow. The wind clawed at my face and I pulled my fur-lined hood tighter. My flashlight beam cut through the swirling frost, scanning the landscape. Nothing but ice. Nothing but endless, untouched snow. But then, movement. Barely visible against the white, a small, trembling form huddled near a jagged ridge of ice. At first I thought it was just another drift, a trick of the storm. But then it moved again, a weak, jerky motion that sent a sharp pang through my chest. A bear cub. Alone. Its fur, once thick and pure white, was now matted with ice, clumped together in a way that sent a silent warning through my mind. No mother in sight. No tracks leading away. Just this tiny creature barely clinging to life. Something was wrong. I took a slow step forward, careful not to startle it. The cub lifted its head, eyes barely open, its breath coming in weak, uneven gasps. It was young, too young to survive on its own. And yet, here it was, alone in the middle of a frozen wasteland, its tiny body shaking violently from the cold. What? Where was its mother? I scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. A bear wouldn't just abandon its cub, not unless something terrible had happened. My heart pounded. I knew the dangers of interfering with nature. If the mother was nearby, she wouldn't take kindly to my presence. But as the seconds stretched on, the silence deepened, and a sickening realization settled in. This cub had been left to die. But why? The storm raged on, and the cub let out another pitiful whimper, barely able to lift its head. Every instinct screamed at me to do something. To help. But taking in a wild polar bear, even a cub, wasn't just dangerous. It was unheard of. And yet, I clenched my fists, torn between logic and the undeniable weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't just walk away. Not when every breath it took seemed more fragile than the last. I had to make a decision. No. The cub's body trembled violently, its tiny frame barely holding on against the merciless Arctic cold. I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest. Every logical part of me knew this was a mistake. Taking in a wild polar bear cub could lead to disaster. And yet, the other part of me, the part that had seen too much death in these lands, couldn't turn away. I crouched low, extending a gloved hand slowly, cautiously. The cub flinched at my movement, but it didn't have the strength to run. That, more than anything, made my stomach twist. A healthy cub would have fought, would have at least tried to defend itself. But this one, it had already accepted its fate. No, not yet. I hesitated for just a second longer before shrugging off my thick outer coat. Carefully, I reached out and wrapped it around the cub's fragile body. It let out a weak whine, its breath warm against my wrist, and I felt the slightest shudder of life in its tiny chest. That was it. The moment I knew I couldn't leave it behind. I lifted the cub gently, cradling it against my chest as I hurried back to my sled. My dogs stirred, their ears perking up as I set the small bundle inside my sled bag, tucking it in as best as I could. The storm was getting worse, the wind picking up force, screaming against the ice. I needed to get back to my cabin. Fast. I snapped the reins, urging the dogs forward. They lunged into the snow, their bodies strong and steady, but the storm was growing more violent by the second. My vision blurred as the wind whipped ice against my goggles, and for a brief moment, a terrible thought crossed my mind. Was this why the cub had been left behind? Had its mother sensed the storm and abandoned it to save herself? No, that wasn't how polar bears worked. A mother would fight to the death for her cub. She would never leave it behind. Unless something had forced her to. The thought sent a shiver through me, one that had nothing to do with the cold. The sled cut through the storm, and after what felt like hours, the faint outline of my cabin emerged through the white haze. Relief washed over me. I pulled the sled to a stop, my hands numb as I grabbed the cub and rushed inside. The warmth hit me instantly, the fire crackling in the hearth, filling the small space with a golden glow. I didn't waste a second. I set the cub down near the fire, grabbing a thick blanket and wrapping it around its shaking body. Its eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark, glassy, unfocused. "It's okay," I murmured, not even sure if I was talking to the cub or myself. "You're safe now." The cub let out a soft, tired whimper, then closed its eyes again. I exhaled, rubbing warmth back into my frozen fingers. My mind was still racing. I had done the impossible. I had taken in a wild polar bear cub. And now I had to figure out what came next. I moved to grab my radio, needing to contact someone, anyone, who might know what to do. But just as I reached for it, something outside caught my eye. A shadow. I froze. It moved quickly, darting just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a low guttural growl. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Through the frost-covered window I saw it. A shape too big to be human. A shape that could only belong to one thing. Another bear. And this one wasn't small. A sickening realization gripped me. The mother hadn't abandoned her cub. She had been hunted. And whatever had killed her was still out there. I didn't move. The fire crackled behind me, casting flickering shadows against the walls, but my attention was locked on the window. The storm howled outside, whipping snow across the glass, distorting the shape in the darkness, but I knew what I had seen. Something big. Something alive. A polar bear? It had to be. But something felt off. I forced myself to breathe, my pulse hammering in my ears. The cub stirred slightly in its bundle near the fire, letting out a faint whimper. The noise was so small, almost nothing over the roar of the storm, but outside the shadow stopped moving. My stomach turned. It had heard. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the rifle mounted on the wall. My fingers trembled as I unhooked it, the weight reassuring yet terrifying in my grip. I had lived in these frozen lands long enough to know that firing a gun at a polar bear was a last resort. They were massive, unpredictable, and worst of all, relentless when they felt threatened. I crept toward the window, pressing my back against the cold wooden wall. Through the fog glass, I could barely make out the shifting shape outside. It moved unnaturally, shoulders hunched as if dragging something. My throat tightened. Was it injured? No, it was something else. Then, in a sudden gust of wind, I saw it. A carcass. The bear wasn't dragging its own injured body. It was dragging another bear. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. The body it pulled was massive, easily twice the size of the cub in my cabin. The truth hit me like a blow to the chest. The cub's mother. A cold dread washed over me. I had been right. The mother hadn't abandoned her cub. She had been killed. But by what? Not this bear. No polar bear drags another's carcass like that. They fight, they kill if they must, but they don't drag the bodies away like trophies. Something was wrong. The bear outside shifted, its head turning slightly as if sensing my presence. My breath hitched. For a moment, I thought its eyes had locked onto mine through the glass, but that was impossible. The storm was too thick, the cabin too dark. And yet, the moment stretched endlessly, a silent, eerie connection buzzing in the space between us. Then in an instant, it dropped the carcass and bolted. Not into the storm. Into the darkness. A primal fear curled in my gut. Polar bears don't run from storms. They don't run from anything, unless they have a reason. Unless something bigger, something worse is out there. I clutched the rifle tighter, barely aware of my own shaking hands. My instincts screamed at me to lock the doors, to barricade the windows, to make myself invisible. But I didn't move. My eyes were still on the lifeless mass of fur lying just beyond the firelight. I had to see. I had to know. With a deep breath, I pulled on my heavy coat and grabbed the lantern. The cub whimpered as I moved, shifting in its bundle, but it was too weak to protest. I hesitated, glancing back at it. Was I about to make a mistake? Probably. I stepped outside. The wind hit me like a wall, nearly knocking the air from my lungs. The cold cut through my clothes like a blade, and the darkness beyond my lantern's glow felt like it was alive, pressing against the edges of the light. I moved forward, my boots crunching over the ice. The body lay just a few feet away, massive and still. The mother. The cub's mother. She had been torn apart. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the lantern. Deep gashes ran along her thick fur, wounds that didn't look like they came from another bear. Claw marks, yes, but too deep, too jagged. And her throat, it wasn't just bitten. It was ripped open, the wound so violent it made my stomach churn. This wasn't a fight. This was a slaughter. The wind howled around me, and for the first time in my life I felt hunted. Like I had stepped into something I wasn't supposed to see. Like something was watching me. I turned sharply, scanning the darkness. Nothing but endless white. Nothing but the whisper of snow swirling over the ice. And yet, somewhere out there, beyond the reach of my lantern, I swore I heard it. A low, deep growl. Not a bear's. Something else. Something I didn't recognize. The growl sent a chill through me, deeper than the Arctic cold ever could. It wasn't the roar of a bear, nor the distant howl of a wolf. It was low, guttural, unnatural, a sound that didn't belong to anything I had ever heard in the tundra. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the rifle. My breath came in short bursts, fogging up in the freezing air as I scanned the darkness beyond the glow of my lantern. Nothing. Only shifting snow, swirling wind, and the silent, unblinking body of the mother bear at my feet. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The blood. The wind hadn't covered it yet. Thick, dark streaks trailed away from the carcass, leading out into the storm. But it wasn't the scattered, erratic pattern of an animal bleeding out. No, these were drag marks. As if something had pulled the bear's body, and then suddenly let go. I forced myself to take a step closer, my boots crunching over the ice. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to get inside where it was safe. But a part of me knew, nowhere was safe. I crouched down, holding my lantern closer to the blood-stained ice. And that's when I saw them. Tracks. Massive prints, partially covered by drifting snow. Bigger than a bear's. Different. Plot. I stared, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The spacing was all wrong. A polar bear's stride was heavy but measured, their paws wide and adapted for walking on ice. These prints? They weren't just wide. They were long. Almost like a bear's, but stretched, distorted. I swallowed, my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Whatever had done this wasn't just some rogue predator. This wasn't a territorial fight. This was something else. A fresh gust of wind screamed through the tundra, and suddenly the lantern in my hand flickered. The darkness around me seemed to press closer, suffocating. The wind wasn't just wind anymore. It carried a sound, a deep, guttural breathing. I turned sharply, my eyes scanning the night. Still nothing. But it was there. Watching. Waiting. A sharp cry jolted me, the cub. I spun around, my boots slipping on the ice as I scrambled back toward the cabin. The warm glow of the fire flickered through the window, but inside I saw movement. Something was in there. The door was still shut. Had I locked it? My mind raced, trying to remember, but I was already running, gripping the rifle so tightly my fingers ached. The moment I reached the door, I threw my shoulder against it and burst inside. The heat slammed into me, a violent contrast to the cold outside. The fire crackled, the cub let out another distressed cry from the corner, but I wasn't alone. Something had been here. The chair near the fire was knocked over. My gear, once neatly stacked, was scattered across the floor. And then I saw the claw marks. Not on the walls. On the floor. Deep grooves dug into the wooden planks, running in a twisted, unnatural pattern. As if something had dragged its claws across the floor while circling the room. My stomach turned to ice. The cub whimpered again, pressing itself against the blankets, its tiny body trembling. It wasn't just cold. It was terrified. I knelt beside it, pressing a shaking hand to its fur. "It's okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible over my own racing heartbeat. "I won't let anything happen to you." I didn't know if that was true. A deep unease crawled through me, something instinctual, something I couldn't explain. The mother bear had been hunted. Not by another bear. Not by wolves. Not by anything I had ever encountered before. And whatever had done it, had followed me back here. I reached for the radio, my fingers fumbling with the dial as static crackled through the speaker. "Come on." The wind howled outside, rattling the walls. The cub let out another soft cry, pressing into my side. I kept turning the dial, searching for a signal, anything. Then, "You're not alone out there." My blood ran cold. The voice on the radio was broken, distorted with static. But I had heard it. A man's voice. Low, urgent. I grabbed the receiver. Who is this? I demanded, my voice sharp. A beat of silence. Then, if you found the cub, it's already too late. The radio cut out. I stared at it, my hands frozen in place. My mind raced. What the hell did that mean? Who was he? And too late for what? A new sound rose above the wind outside. A low, deep growl. Closer this time. I turned toward the window. And then, a shape moved. Not in the distance. Right outside the glass. A flash of white fur, twisted in a way no bear should move. And eyes, reflecting the firelight. Watching me. The cub pressed tighter against me. Outside, the growl deepened. And then, the door handle turned. The door handle twisted slowly, not the way the wind would shake it, not the way a desperate animal would claw at it. This was deliberate. My pulse thundered in my ears. The cub whimpered, its tiny body pressing against me as if it could disappear into the floor. My hands shook as I gripped the rifle, aiming it at the door. And then, the handle stopped moving. Silence. Even the wind outside had gone still, as if the tundra itself was holding its breath. For a second I thought maybe, whatever was out there had left. Maybe it had seen the fire, sensed the threat, and backed away into the blizzard. And then the door exploded inward. A blast of icy wind knocked me backward, my boots skidding against the wooden floor. The lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. The only light left came from the fire, and in its flickering glow, I finally saw it. Not a bear. Not a wolf. Something in between. It stood on all fours, massive and covered in thick, white fur, but its limbs were too long, its movements too unnatural. Its head was low, its breath misting in the freezing air as it stepped inside. Its eyes, too intelligent, too calculating, locked onto me. The rifle. I raised it, finger tightening on the trigger. The thing stopped. It didn't lunge. It didn't attack. Just watched. Then, as if considering something, it tilted its head. A slow, deliberate motion. And suddenly, a horrifying thought hit me. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the cub. I shifted slightly, blocking the tiny creature with my body. "You're not getting it," I muttered, voice shaking. The thing blinked. And then, it smiled. Not in a way an animal should. Not a snarl. An actual, twisted, unnatural smile. I didn't wait. I fired. The gunshot shattered the silence. The thing jerked back, a splatter of red hitting the snow-covered doorway. I scrambled up, grabbing the cub as it let out a frightened cry. My boots barely found traction on the icy floor, but I ran like hell. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. The snowstorm swallowed us. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath was ragged in my throat. The cub was heavy in my arms, its little body trembling. I had no idea where I was going, just away. Away from whatever that thing was. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, the outpost. A single blinking red light on a radio tower, barely visible through the storm. I pushed forward, lungs aching, feet numb. Almost there. And then, the cub tensed. I felt it before I heard it. Something behind us. The same deep, slow breathing. I turned my head just a little. And in the distance, through the thick, swirling snow, two glowing eyes watched me. Not attacking. Not chasing. Just waiting. I didn't stop. I crashed through the outpost door, bolting it shut behind me. The radio operator inside jumped to his feet. "What the hell?" I ignored him, grabbing the radio. "We need extraction. Now." Static. Then a response. "Copy that. Stand by." I finally let out a breath. The cub pressed against me, its tiny body still shaking. I stroked its fur, whispering, "You're safe now." But as I stared at the snow-covered window, I knew I was lying. Out there beyond the glass, something still watched. And it wasn't finished yet.